wind howled across the lonely plains of Missouri, bending the dry grass and rattling the old splintered fences that stood like tired sentinels over the land. It was the kind of place where time didn't move so much as it dragged itself forward, where poverty was inherited like eye color, and where every child grew up learning that dreams were for other people. In the middle of this forgotten landscape in 1873, a baby girl named Arizona Donnie Clark came into the world. Nobody could have guessed that the same girl, born in a place where even hope struggled to survive, would one day be known as Ma Barker, America's most dangerous mother, the woman who raised a brood of outlaws that would terrorize the heartland. Arizona's early life was quiet but not gentle. Her family lived on the edge of survival, scraping by with small harvests and hard labor. She learned early that softness had no place in her world. The Clark family was strict but not unkind, grounded in faith and the simple codes of rural life. Work hard, obey the law, and keep your head down. Yet even as a child, Arizona had a restless streak. There was a fire in her eyes, the kind that burned too hot for a life confined to chores and sermons. She wanted more than dirt roads and hand-me-down dreams. She wanted to be seen, to be remembered. When she was a teenager, that restlessness drew her toward the wrong kind of excitement: town dances, wandering men, promises of love whispered under the sound of crickets and whiskey. It was at one of those dances that she met George Barker, a tall, rugged man with charm enough to hide his flaws. He worked odd jobs, drank more than he should, and carried the look of someone who'd made peace with mediocrity. But to Arizona, he was a ticket out of the life she hated. They married young, too young, in a small ceremony that felt more like a beginning than a blessing. By her early 20s, she was a mother, her hands full and her hopes shrinking with every hungry cry of a newborn. The Barkers lived the hard life of the rural poor. George drifted from one menial job to another while Arizona, who'd soon take to calling herself Ma, as though the title gave her power, raised their growing family. One by one the boys came: Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, Doc, and Fred. Each son brought with him a mix of pride and burden. The house was small, the money was smaller, and George's patience was thinner than ever. He wasn't cruel, but he was absent, beaten down by the endless grind of survival. Ma filled that void with a fierce love, but it was a love that didn't teach discipline. It taught loyalty, blind and absolute. Her boys were her world, and she'd do anything to protect them from it. The neighbors saw her as a tough woman, loud when she wanted to be, proud of her family even when the gossip whispered otherwise. She wasn't the kind of woman to be embarrassed by a son's troublemaking. If the sheriff came knocking, she'd stand on the porch, arms crossed, daring him to prove her boys had done wrong. "My boys ain't bad," she'd snap. "They just got bad luck." To outsiders, she was stubborn. To her sons, she was untouchable. It was around this time that the first cracks started to show. The Barker boys grew up wild, untamed by school or church. They were clever but restless, mirrors of their mother's defiance. They'd steal apples from a merchant's cart, take a horse for a joyride, and come home to Ma's laughter rather than her scolding. To her, these weren't crimes. They were proof that her sons had spirit, that they wouldn't let anyone push them around. When the teachers complained, she said her boys were too smart for school. When the police warned her, she told them to mind their own business. She thought she was protecting them. In truth, she was sharpening their edges. As the years passed, George Barker grew tired. Tired of the fights, tired of the noise, tired of watching his sons slide into trouble while their mother cheered them on. One day, without ceremony or goodbye, he packed his things and left. Some say he'd had enough of Arizona's temper. Others say he simply couldn't compete for his son's loyalty. Whatever the reason, his absence only made her stronger in their eyes. Now, she wasn't just their mother, she was their leader. Without George, the Barker home became a fortress of its own kind. Ma's word was law. The boys could do no wrong, and she made sure they knew it. If one got arrested, she scraped together bail money. If one got beaten in a fight, she went to confront the offender herself. The more the world tried to correct them, the more she resisted. Her protection became suffocating, her love intoxicating. She wasn't raising sons anymore, she was building soldiers. By the time they reached adulthood, the Barker boys had reputations that stretched far beyond their hometown. Herman, the eldest, had a charming smile and a mean streak that could turn on a dime. He liked women, whiskey, and quick money. Lloyd was quieter but calculating, the kind who'd rather plan a crime than execute it. Doc, the most dangerous of the four, had a temper like a lit fuse, short and deadly. And then there was Fred, the youngest, Ma's favorite. He was handsome, reckless, and fiercely loyal to his mother. She adored him more than any of the others, and everyone knew it. Together, the Barker boys formed the core of a small-time crime ring, bootlegging during Prohibition, stealing cars, robbing stores, and roughing up anyone who got in their way. Their crimes weren't genius, but they were bold. They robbed not because they needed to, but because it made them feel powerful. And in the shadows, Ma Barker watched it all unfold, never lifting a gun, but never stopping them either. She rented rooms under false names, fed the boys, cleaned up their messes, and made sure the law stayed confused. When the police questioned her, she played the part of the ignorant mother perfectly. "I don't know what my boys get up to," she'd say sweetly, her eyes steady and unflinching. "They're good boys at heart," but behind that innocent face was something darker, a pride in what her sons had become. The newspapers began to take notice of the Barker boys, linking them to robberies and bootlegging rings across the Midwest. And every headline that mentioned the name Barker seemed to give Ma more satisfaction. She had raised 4 sons who refused to bow to anyone. They were feared, they were famous, and they were hers. Still, fame comes at a cost. The more they stole, the more the law hunted them. Herman's reckless streak grew worse. In 1927, after a botched robbery, he found himself cornered by police. Rather than surrender, he chose death on his own terms, shooting himself in the car before the police could take him alive. The news shattered Ma, but not in the way people expected. She didn't weep in public. She didn't curse the law. Instead, she grew colder, harder, and more determined. She told anyone who would listen that her son died a hero, not a criminal. "He wasn't afraid," she said. "None of my boys ever are." Herman's death marked a turning point. The Barker family crossed an invisible line that day, from petty criminals to fugitives of national interest. The surviving brothers didn't slow down. They escalated. Their crimes grew bigger, their targets richer, their weapons deadlier. The money started to flow, and so did the blood. The Great Depression was tearing America apart. Banks failed, jobs vanished, and families starved. In the chaos, men like the Barker boys found opportunity. People who had nothing to lose were easy to recruit, and the public, disillusioned with the system, sometimes even rooted for the outlaws who defied it. The Barker name began to echo through the heartland, whispered in bars and shouted in newsrooms. And always, somewhere nearby, Ma Barker was there, watching, waiting, whispering advice to her sons as they planned their next move. She became the ghost in the machine of their criminal empire. She rented safe houses, laundered money, and made sure the gang stayed one step ahead of the law. To outsiders, she was a frail, middle-aged woman who seemed harmless. But inside her family, she was the center of gravity. Every decision passed through her. Every move needed her approval. The Barker boys might have carried the guns, but Ma carried the power, and yet, for all her cunning, Ma Barker was no criminal mastermind in the traditional sense. She wasn't the one mapping out heists or coordinating getaways. Her influence came from her sons' devotion to her. They feared disappointing her more than they feared the law. When one of them got sloppy, she'd let him know with a few cold words that cut deeper than any punishment. When they succeeded, she'd praise them like a queen, rewarding her knights. It wasn't logic that kept them loyal. It was love, raw and relentless. But love, when twisted by ambition and pride, can turn into something dangerous. Ma Barker's faith in her sons blinded her to their growing brutality. She didn't see the way Fred's eyes changed after each robbery, how Doc started drinking heavier, or how Lloyd's paranoia began eating away at his sanity. She thought they were invincible. She thought she could protect them forever. What she didn't know was that the world was changing. The FBI was rising in power, led by a man named J. Edgar Hoover, a man who needed victories, needed villains, and found both in families like hers. The Barker name was becoming a problem for the Bureau, not just because of their crimes, but because of their legend. Hoover understood that myths had power, and he wasn't about to let the Barker myth grow unchecked. He needed to crush it, and to do that, he'd have to destroy its heart. For now, though, the Barkers were still riding high. They had survived more shootouts than they could count, outsmarted police across multiple states, and kept their freedom when so many others had fallen. Ma was proud, but somewhere deep inside her, there was a flicker of unease she refused to acknowledge. The nights were getting quieter, the boys were getting restless, and the law was closing in. The story of Ma Barker was only beginning to take its darkest turn, a story of love twisted into obsession, loyalty turned to ruin, and a mother who would rather die beside her sons than live without them. The road ahead would lead to blood, betrayal, and one final standoff that would echo across American history. But in this moment, as the sun set over the Missouri horizon, Ma Barker sat in her chair, a cigarette in her hand and pride in her heart, believing that nothing could ever break the bond she had forged with her boys. She was wrong. By the time the 1930s dawned, America was unraveling. The Great Depression had turned cities into graveyards of hope, and the countryside into a wasteland of hunger. Families were losing everything: farms, homes, futures, while the rich clung to their fortunes behind iron gates. The Barker boys, once petty crooks with small-town ambitions, found themselves standing at the edge of a new kind of opportunity, an America where desperation had replaced morality and crime wasn't rebellion anymore. It was survival. Ma Barker understood this instinctively. She'd lived her whole life on the wrong side of luck, and now that the whole country was suffering, she saw a strange kind of equality. For once, everyone was desperate, and that meant her boys were no longer outcasts. They were products of the times. Fred and Doc were the first to escalate. Bank robbery wasn't new to them, but now they did it with precision and arrogance, studying routes, timing security guards, and learning the value of silence when pulling a job. They didn't just storm in waving guns, they planned. And in the smoky corners of bars where criminals whispered deals over cheap whiskey, the Barker boys began attracting attention. It was there they met Alvin Karpis, a man whose cold logic and ruthless intelligence set him apart from the usual reckless thugs. Karpis had eyes like steel and a voice that never rose, a strategist who could see 3 moves ahead in a world where most men only saw one. He recognized the potential in the Barker brothers, their loyalty, their nerve, their family bond. And he recognized something else too, the power Ma had over them. Ma Barker and Karpis were opposites. He was methodical, calculating, and emotionless. She was emotional, impulsive, and loyal to a fault, but when they joined forces, they created something formidable. The Barker-Karpis Gang was born not in a single moment, but through a slow merging of instincts, his brains and her control. Fred became the field man, Doc handled logistics, Lloyd played the quiet observer, and Ma, though she never touched a weapon, became the glue that held them together. The gang's first major success came with a string of bank robberies across Kansas, Iowa, and Minnesota. They'd hit small-town banks where the law was thin and escape routes were plenty. Sometimes they posed as businessmen scouting property, other times as traveling salesmen or road crews. They used stolen cars with swapped plates, and Ma was often the one who rented the safe houses where they'd hide afterward. To the neighbors, she was just another widow traveling with her sons, polite and unassuming. To the gang, she was the matriarch, the woman who cooked their meals, burned their evidence, and reminded them that loyalty was everything. The newspapers began to paint a picture of the Barker-Karpis Gang as a rising criminal empire. They were meticulous and merciless, never hesitating to shoot if cornered. And as their legend grew, so did Ma's. Reporters were fascinated by the image of a middle-aged woman orchestrating chaos from behind the scenes. Some claimed she was the mastermind, the brains behind every move. Others dismissed her as a mother too weak to control her sons. But in truth, Ma Barker existed somewhere in between. Neither genius nor fool, but a woman who had built her entire identity around her family's defiance. Every crime they committed was an act of love twisted into something monstrous. The gang's most infamous acts, however, weren't robberies. They were kidnappings. The idea came from Karpis. Banks were becoming harder targets, with better alarms and armed guards. But rich men were everywhere, and their families were soft targets. The first kidnapping went smoothly enough. A St. Paul banker named William Ham Jr. snatched off the street and held in a rented house while the gang demanded $100,000 for his release. The ransom was paid, Ham was returned unharmed, and the Barkers walked away richer and more confident than ever. Emboldened, they struck again. this time taking Edward Bremer, another wealthy Midwestern businessman. The ransom, $200,000. It was a bold move, one that caught the full attention of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. Hoover had been looking for a way to justify his growing power, to prove that his bureau was the ultimate weapon against the chaos of the Depression's criminal underworld. The Barker-Karpis Gang gave him exactly what he needed: a villainous family to serve as a symbol of evil, a mother whose very existence blurred the line between domestic love and cold-blooded crime. While the FBI scrambled to track them down, the Barkers continued to move through the Midwest like shadows. They switched cars constantly, used fake names, and stayed in safe houses for no more than a week or two. Ma handled the logistics. She was always the one to deal with landlords, to pay in cash, to charm suspicious neighbors with small talk and homemade pies. Her sons hid their weapons when she was around, half out of respect, half out of superstition. She had a way of keeping them calm even as the world burned around them. But inside the gang, tension was growing. Karpis and Fred clashed often, Karpis's cold efficiency versus Fred's reckless pride. Ma tried to mediate, but her favoritism made things worse. Fred could do no wrong in her eyes, and Karpis knew it. He began to see Ma as a liability, too emotional, too unpredictable. Yet even he couldn't deny her influence. When morale dropped, Ma's presence brought it back. When fear crept in, her words steadied their nerves. To her boys, she wasn't a liability. She was home. Meanwhile, the FBI was closing in. They had traced ransom money, intercepted letters, and were slowly mapping the network of safe houses the gang used. One by one, members of the Barker-Karpis network were caught or killed. Lloyd Barker was arrested in Kansas. Doc went into hiding. Fred and Ma, inseparable as ever, fled further south. Hoover wanted them all, but especially Ma. He wanted to destroy the myth, to make an example out of her. The most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade, he called her publicly, though many inside the Bureau privately doubted she had that kind of power. Still, it made for a better story, and Hoover understood that in law enforcement, legends could be just as useful as facts. Ma and Fred eventually found refuge in Florida, renting a lakeside house near Lake Weir under the aliases Mrs. Clark and Fred Clark. It was a quiet, peaceful spot, far from the chaos of their former lives, surrounded by swaying trees and calm water. To the locals, they were polite tenants who kept to themselves. Ma spent her mornings on the porch, humming old folk tunes, while Fred tinkered with the car or read the newspaper. But beneath that calm surface, there was a tension that never quite faded. Fred was restless. He missed the adrenaline, the rush of living on the edge. Ma, on the other hand, wanted to freeze time, to keep her last remaining son safe in the illusion of peace. The irony was cruel. The woman who had spent her life running from poverty now had money but nowhere to spend it. She was trapped by her own legend, a fugitive whose name was too famous to ever find rest. She tried to convince herself that she had done what any mother would: protect her sons, stand by them, love them unconditionally. But in the quiet moments by the lake, when the cicadas hummed and the sun dipped low, doubt began to creep in. She thought about Herman, about the blood in the car, about Lloyd rotting in prison, about Doc's letters that came less and less often. And then she looked at Fred, still devoted to her, still her little boy despite the blood on his hands, and she knew she couldn't turn back. It was too late for guilt. All she had left was loyalty. Back in Washington, Hoover was preparing the endgame. The FBI had tracked a series of clues that led them straight to Florida: an intercepted letter, a spotted alias, a payment traced through a contact. When they confirmed the Clark name and matched it to Ma and Fred Barker, Hoover gave the order: surround the house, take them alive if possible, dead if necessary. He wanted this one to be public. He wanted the world to see what happened to those who defied the law. And so, while Ma and Fred sat in their quiet house, sipping coffee and pretending the world outside had forgotten them, a storm was gathering. Agents were already moving through the trees, setting up positions, waiting for the signal. The end of the Barker story was near, though neither mother nor son knew it yet. They were sitting in the eye of the storm, still clinging to the illusion that love could outlast justice. For now, though, their world remained deceptively calm. Ma cooked dinner that night, beans, cornbread, and fried ham, the way she had when her boys were little. Fred laughed at one of her stories, the sound echoing across the still water. In that moment, they could almost believe they were just mother and son again. Not fugitives, not killers, not ghosts in hiding. The radio played softly from the corner, broadcasting the latest news about America's recovery, about the banks reopening, about a world slowly pulling itself out of despair. Ma smiled faintly. "See, Freddie," she said. "Things always turn around. They always do." But somewhere in her voice, beneath the hope, was a tremor she couldn't hide, a sense that she was speaking more to herself than to him. She didn't know that in just a few days that quiet lakeside peace would erupt into one of the bloodiest standoffs in FBI history. She didn't know that the legend of Ma Barker, the mother who lived and died for her sons, was about to be written in gunfire. The night deepened. The wind rustled through the trees, and in the darkness, the shadows moved closer. The days leading up to the shootout at Lake Weir felt like the calm before a storm that everyone except Ma Barker and her son could feel. The house they rented sat at the edge of the water, surrounded by moss-draped trees that swayed in the humid Florida air. To anyone passing by, it looked ordinary, a peaceful retreat for a mother and her boy. But inside, there was tension hanging over every quiet moment, a heaviness that even the warm sunlight couldn't chase away. Fred Barker would often sit by the window with his pistol on the table, eyes watching the tree line, as if expecting ghosts to step out at any minute. Ma would hum softly from the kitchen, pretending not to notice, pretending that everything was fine. It was how she had survived her whole life, by ignoring the truth until it broke down the door. The FBI had been closing in for weeks. They had traced a letter from Doc Barker, who had been captured and interrogated after a gunfight in Chicago. Under pressure, the Bureau had gathered fragments of information that finally led them to the quiet lakeside house, rented under the name Clark. Local law enforcement had helped confirm it. The mother was older, small and talkative, and the son matched the description of Fred Barker. The pieces fit together perfectly. Hoover's men were ecstatic. The director himself saw the case as personal vindication, a public victory to cement his bureau's dominance over America's criminal underworld. He wanted blood, but he wanted it with a headline attached. Meanwhile, life inside that house went on in slow motion. Ma Barker clung to her routines, maybe because she needed to believe they were still in control. She would wake before sunrise, make coffee in a tin pot, and watch the mist rise over the water. She'd call Fred to breakfast, and they'd sit together, talking about everything except the truth. Sometimes she'd reminisce about the old days back in Missouri, about the boys when they were young and innocent. She'd talk about Herman's grin, about Lloyd's quiet intelligence, about Doc's temper, and how Fred always managed to calm him down. Fred would smile faintly, but his eyes stayed hard. He knew those days were gone. He knew the law wasn't far behind them. He'd read the newspapers, the ones that called his mother the most dangerous woman in America. The words made him angry. "You see this, Ma?" he'd growl. "They think you're running the show. They think you're some kind of mob boss." She'd laugh softly and shake her head. "Let them think what they want," she'd say. "You and me, Freddie, we know the truth." And maybe she believed it, that she was just a mother, that she had never meant for things to go this far. But somewhere deep down, she must have known that the legend was bigger than either of them now. The Barker name had become mythic. Newspapers printed exaggerated stories of her commanding her sons to kill, of her keeping police at bay with a rifle in her hand, of her ordering bank robberies like a general ordering troops. None of it could be proven, but the myth was too good to resist. It sold papers, it frightened the public, and it gave Hoover exactly what he wanted, a villain to justify his empire. In truth, Ma Barker's power was emotional, not strategic. Her sons committed their crimes not because she told them to, but because they couldn't bear to disappoint her. Every robbery, every kidnapping, every bullet fired in defiance of the law was a way to keep her proud. That pride had been their compass for so long that even as the law closed in, they couldn't imagine betraying it. Fred knew they should probably move again. The quiet was too perfect, the safety too fragile. But when he suggested it, Ma brushed him off. "We've been running all our lives, Freddie," she said. Ain't you tired of it? Let's stay a while. The law don't even know we're here. But they did know. The FBI had already surrounded the area, mapping every road in and out. On the evening of January 15th, 1935, agents began taking positions under cover of darkness. They moved quietly through the trees, their boots sinking into the wet soil. The plan was to wait until morning, to strike when visibility was clear. Inside the house, Ma and Fred were unaware of the trap closing around them. That night the air was thick and still. Frogs croaked near the water, and the hum of insects filled the darkness. Fred cleaned his guns before bed, while Ma sat knitting by the lamp, her spectacles perched low on her nose. To an outsider, it was a picture of domestic peace, an old woman and her son at home. But beneath the surface, there was an invisible thread pulling tighter and tighter. At dawn, the first light of January 16th crept over the horizon, glinting off the calm surface of the lake. The FBI agents waited for the signal. There were more than a dozen of them, heavily armed, crouched behind trees and parked vehicles. At 7 a.m., they moved in quietly, surrounding the house. Then came the shout, "Fred Barker!"
Ma Barker, this is the FBI! Come out with your hands up!
The silence that followed stretched like a held breath. Birds scattered from the trees. Inside, Fred froze. He looked at his mother. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Fred moved toward the window, peering out just enough to see the men with rifles aimed at the house. "They found us," he whispered. Ma stood slowly, her face pale but calm. "What are you going to do, Freddie?" she asked softly. He turned to her, and there was something fierce in his eyes. "I ain't going to no prison," he said. "They'll have to kill me first." Ma didn't argue. She just nodded, almost sadly. Maybe she knew this was how it would end. Maybe she'd known it all along. The first shot rang out, sharp and deafening. Then another. Within seconds, the quiet of the lake exploded into chaos. Bullets ripped through the walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Fred fired back through the windows, ducking behind furniture as the air filled with smoke and dust. The gunfire echoed across the water like thunder. The agents took cover, returning fire in controlled bursts. It was supposed to be a quick operation, but Fred's resistance turned it into a full-blown siege. Inside, Ma shouted for him to keep his head down, her voice barely audible over the roar of gunfire. Some say she picked up a weapon herself, others claim she never touched one. The truth was buried under the chaos. All that mattered was that she stayed beside him, refusing to flee or surrender. For 4 long hours, the house became a war zone. The walls were chewed apart by bullets, the furniture shredded. Smoke filled every room, choking the air. Fred's ammunition began to run low, but he kept firing, desperate and furious. At one point, he called out to the agents, cursing them, daring them to come in. They didn't. They just kept shooting. The agents outside began to wonder if anyone inside was still alive. The return fire had slowed, but they weren't taking chances. They kept their guns trained on the house, waiting for movement. The sun climbed higher, and the Florida heat turned the air thick and unbearable. Then finally, the shooting stopped. A heavy silence settled over the scene. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the faint crackle of smoke from the bullet-pocked walls. When the agents finally approached, weapons drawn, the house was unrecognizable. The windows were shattered, the furniture overturned, the walls scarred with hundreds of bullet holes. Inside, they found Fred Barker lying face down near the front room, a rifle beside him. His body was riddled with bullets. In a nearby bedroom, they found Ma Barker, slumped against the bed. She had been shot several times. A pistol lay near her hand, though no one could say for sure if she'd fired it. The official report would claim she had gone down fighting, weapon in hand. Others believed she never fired a shot. But in the end, it didn't matter. She was dead, and so was her son. Word of the shootout spread like wildfire. Within hours, the story was in every newspaper across the country. Ma Barker killed in bloody gun battle. The headlines screamed. The FBI paraded their victory, showcasing photographs of the bullet-ridden house, the lifeless bodies, the weapons recovered. Hoover himself released a statement praising his agents and labeling Ma Barker as the most vicious, dangerous woman criminal America has ever known. It was exactly the image he wanted, a triumph of law over evil, a symbol of order restored. But not everyone believed it. Barker-Karpis, who was still on the run at the time, later scoffed at Hoover's version. Ma wasn't no mastermind, he said. She couldn't plan breakfast, let alone a bank job. To Karpis, the idea that Ma Barker had led the gang was laughable. She was, in his eyes, just a mother who loved her sons too much to turn her back on them. But Hoover needed a monster, and Ma Barker fit the role perfectly. The myth had already taken root, and no amount of truth could uproot it. After the shootout, the bodies were taken to a nearby funeral home, where curious locals came to see the infamous mother and son laid out side by side. Some pitied her. Others cursed her name. Children whispered that her ghost still haunted the lake, forever protecting her boys. The legend grew, twisting itself into folklore. She became part of the American criminal mythology, a figure both feared and misunderstood. What the public didn't see was the small, quiet funeral held afterward, attended by few. The other Barker brothers were either dead or imprisoned, and there was no one left to speak for her. The woman who had once held her family together through sheer force of will was buried with little ceremony. The world moved on quickly, as it always does, but her story lingered. In the years that followed, writers, filmmakers, and journalists would reinvent Ma Barker countless times, sometimes as a ruthless criminal mastermind, other times as a tragic mother consumed by love and loyalty. The truth, like the smoke that had filled that Florida house, drifted away into the air, impossible to capture. What remained was an image, a mother who refused to abandon her son, even as the world turned its guns on her. The lake where she died remains quiet now. The trees have grown thicker, the house long gone. But if you stand there at dawn, when the mist rolls over the water and the world is silent, you can almost imagine the echo of gunfire, the shadow of a woman standing beside her boy, defying fate until the very end. In the aftermath of the Lake Weir shootout, the dust had barely settled before the legend began to take shape. The newspapers wasted no time turning Ma Barker's name into a symbol, a cautionary tale, and a headline that sold by the millions. Across America, her story was printed in black ink and bold letters. Public enemy mother killed in gun battle. Ma Barker meets her end. The devil's mom. The photos were even worse. They showed her lifeless body sprawled on a bed, her son Fred lying nearby, blood pooling beneath them. For the readers at breakfast tables across the country, it was shocking and sensational, the final act of a criminal saga that seemed ripped from a dime novel. But behind those sensational headlines, the truth was far more complicated, far more human, and far more tragic. The FBI used the moment to cement its reputation as America's new guardian of justice. J. Edgar Hoover personally crafted the narrative. To him, the story wasn't about a desperate mother and her doomed son. It was about the Bureau's triumph, about order prevailing over chaos. He described Ma Barker as the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the last decade, a mastermind who had orchestrated kidnappings, murders, and robberies across the Midwest. He painted her as a woman without conscience, the true leader behind the Barker-Karpis Gang, manipulating her sons like pawns in a grand criminal empire. The nation believed him because Hoover's voice carried authority. His FBI had become a symbol of control in a world that felt like it was falling apart. Depression, gang wars, corruption, and despair. The people wanted heroes, and Hoover gave them one. Himself. But the people who actually knew the Barkers told a very different story. They remembered an old woman who fretted over her boys, who packed sandwiches before they went on jobs, who kept their clothes clean and the coffee hot. Alvin Karpis, the last surviving member of the gang, would later write that Ma Barker was no mastermind. She was a superstitious, simple woman who couldn't organize a two-car parade. To him, the idea that she was the brains of their operation was ridiculous. She didn't plan crimes, he said. She didn't even understand half of what we were doing. She was just there because her boys wanted her there. But perhaps that was exactly what made her dangerous in her own way. Ma Barker didn't lead with intelligence or strategy. She led with love, the kind that blinds, the kind that makes monsters out of men who only want to make their mothers proud. Every bullet fired by her sons, every dollar stolen, was a twisted tribute to the woman who never judged them, never turned them away. She gave them the one thing the world refused them, acceptance. And in return, they gave her loyalty, unquestioning, unbreakable loyalty. In the weeks after the shootout, the FBI continued to round up the remnants of the Barker-Karpis Gang. Doc Barker, captured months earlier, was sentenced to life in Alcatraz. He would later be shot and killed while trying to escape. Lloyd, the youngest, had already been behind bars for years. Herman had taken his own life long before the FBI came knocking. The family that had once ruled the back roads of the Midwest was gone, scattered like ashes. For the small-town folks who had once whispered about Ma Barker's boys, the news was met with a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Some saw justice served, others saw tragedy fulfilled. She wasn't evil, one neighbor recalled years later. She was just a mother who couldn't say no. But to the rest of the country, the myth had already replaced the woman. The photographs of her body were published in newspapers and magazines, displayed as trophies of Hoover's war on crime. The public saw a monster, not a mother. Hoover, ever the opportunist, made sure that image stuck. In speeches, he referenced her often, describing her as proof that even women could become as ruthless as any man when it came to criminality. It was propaganda, of course, designed to terrify and to glorify his agency. He needed villains to justify his crusade, and Ma Barker was the perfect one. Female, maternal, and utterly unrepentant, or so he said. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was the story, and that story took on a life of its own. Hollywood came calling within a decade, turning her into a character larger than life. In movies and pulp novels, Ma Barker became a gun-toting matriarch who ordered her sons to rob and kill with an iron will. In some versions, she was cold and calculating. In others, she was deranged, a woman who'd traded her soul for control. Each retelling pushed her further from reality and closer to myth. The line between fact and fiction blurred until there was no separating them. But somewhere, beneath the exaggerations, there was still the truth. A poor woman from Missouri who raised her children in a world that offered them no chance at redemption. Her life had been a long struggle against poverty, humiliation, and the constant judgment of a society that saw her family as trash. When her boys turned to crime, she didn't stop them. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she believed it was the only way they could ever have anything that felt like success. The Depression years had turned good men into thieves, desperate men into killers, and mothers into accomplices. Ma Barker wasn't born wicked. She was made by circumstance, by a system that gave her sons no future and gave her no reason to hope. As the years passed, people began to revisit her story with new eyes. Historians questioned the FBI's account, pointing out the inconsistencies, the lack of evidence proving her direct involvement, the testimony of surviving gang members, and the exaggerated nature of Hoover's reports. The more people looked, the more it seemed like Ma Barker had been a convenient scapegoat, a character invented to serve the Bureau's narrative. Killing an old woman might have looked brutal, but labeling her a mastermind turned it into a triumph. The truth didn't just die with her. It was buried beneath propaganda and pride. But even myths have roots in something real. Ma Barker may not have been a criminal genius, but she was far from innocent. She loved her sons with a fierceness that defied logic, that blinded her to the destruction they caused. She harbored fugitives, helped them hide from the law, and refused to abandon them no matter how deep they sank. In her mind, that wasn't crime, it was motherhood. The rest of the world saw her as complicit, even responsible. But in her heart, she believed she was protecting her boys from a world that had already decided their fate. The irony was that her devotion, the thing that made her human, was also what destroyed her. When the FBI surrounded that Florida house, they weren't just closing in on a gang. They were closing in on the last piece of a family bound by love and loyalty. Her death marked the end of an era, not just for the Barkers, but for the outlaw age itself. The world was changing. The Great Depression was waning, organized crime was evolving, and the romantic image of the gun-toting outlaw was fading into history. The government had won. The legends were now relics. Yet Ma Barker refused to disappear completely. Her story lingered in the shadows of American folklore, a ghost haunting the intersection between love and crime. People argued about her legacy for decades. Was she a monster, a manipulator, or just a mother who loved too deeply? Some called her evil, others pitied her, but everyone remembered her. By the 1950s, her name had become shorthand for maternal corruption. Ma Barker was invoked whenever someone wanted to describe a domineering, criminally inclined mother figure. The movies portrayed her as almost mythological, a symbol of how even love can turn poisonous. One film in the 1960s depicted her leading her sons on a violent spree, cold and commanding, her voice dripping with cruelty. It was entertaining, but it wasn't real. The woman behind the myth had been gone for decades, her grave a quiet, unmarked resting place in the soil of Missouri. Sometimes, in interviews, old FBI agents who had been at the scene of the shootout would be asked what really happened that morning. Their answers varied. Some said she fired a machine gun from the bedroom window. Others admitted they never actually saw her shoot. One agent even confessed that the weapon found near her body might have been planted after the fact, to make the story cleaner, to make the death seem justified. The Bureau, after all, needed its heroes. And heroes don't shoot unarmed old women. In that sense, Ma Barker's death wasn't just the end of her life, it was the beginning of a national myth. America has always loved its outlaws, and it has always loved its villains. They represent something raw and primal about the human spirit, the defiance of authority, the refusal to bow. Ma Barker fit perfectly into that narrative. She became the dark mirror of the American dream, a mother who gave everything for her family and lost everything in return. And maybe that's why her story endures. Because beneath the violence in the headlines, there's something deeply tragic about her. She wasn't driven by greed or ambition, but by something universal. The need to be loved, the need to belong, the need to matter. She found meaning in her sons, even when the world saw them as monsters. And in doing so, she became one herself, at least in the eyes of history. Even now, nearly a century later, her story still sparks debate. Some historians argue she was framed by a patriarchal system that couldn't comprehend a woman being powerful without being evil. Others believe she was complicit, that she knew exactly what she was doing. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between, a gray area that history often refuses to explore. But that gray area is where the real Ma Barker lived and died. In the end, she remains an enigma. A mother, a criminal, a victim, a legend. Her house by the lake is gone, but the echo of that final gunfight still lingers in the collective imagination. And maybe that's what she wanted all along, to be remembered, to not fade into obscurity. For all her sins and all her love, she achieved something her sons never could. Immortality in the pages of history, even if the story written there isn't the one she lived. The years after the deaths of Ma and Fred Barker were strange ones for America. The Great Depression had begun to ease its chokehold, and the country was crawling toward recovery. People were trying to forget the long shadow cast by the gangsters of the early 1930s, but their ghosts lingered in the collective imagination. Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Babyface Nelson. Their names had been written in blood and ink, burned into the pages of a nation that had loved them as much as it had feared them. And then there was Ma Barker, the woman who didn't fit the mold. Her story was different. She was not the young, reckless outlaw with charm or swagger. She was a middle-aged mother, gray-haired, homely, and, if Hoover was to be believed, the criminal brain behind one of the most violent gangs in American history. That contradiction fascinated people. It was almost too strange to be true, and perhaps it wasn't. In the quiet months that followed the Lake Weir shootout, Hoover and his bureau continued to shape the legend to their liking. He gave interviews to newspapers, crafted press releases, and personally supervised the publication of the FBI's version of events. In that version, Ma Barker was the ruthless matriarch who had trained her sons from childhood to be killers and thieves, who had guided every robbery, every kidnapping, every act of violence with cold precision. The most dangerous mother in America, one headline called her. The phrase stuck. It became her identity, the label that would outlive the truth. But beneath the polished reports and sensational headlines, another narrative was taking shape. It was whispered among those who had known her, those who had crossed paths with the Barkers in the years before the law caught up. They described a woman who was less a mastermind and more a relic of another time. A woman who had been hardened by poverty, who had loved her sons so blindly that she couldn't see what they had become. To those people, Ma Barker wasn't evil. She was tragic, a mother out of her depth in a world that had turned mean and desperate. In a small town in Missouri, far from the Florida lake where she had died, there were people who still remembered her as Aunt Kate. They remembered her as a neighbor who had borrowed sugar and swapped gossip on front porches, who had scolded her boys for fighting and bragged about them in the same breath. She had been proud, too proud maybe, but not cruel. When her name began appearing in national newspapers alongside words like monster and murderous, those who knew her laughed bitterly. She wasn't like that, one old neighbor would later tell a reporter. She couldn't even drive a car, let alone run a gang. But the world didn't want the truth. It wanted a story, and stories have a way of surviving facts. By the late 1930s, the Barker-Karpis Gang was finished. Alvin Karpis, the last surviving member, had been captured in 1936. Hoover had personally staged the arrest to make up for the embarrassment of his agent's earlier blunders. When Karpis was brought in, Hoover posed for photographs, holding Karpis by the arm and smiling for the cameras. It was theater, carefully orchestrated, designed to paint the FBI as the saviors of civilization. In that same breath, Hoover used the capture to once again invoke the ghost of Ma Barker. He told reporters that her influence had shaped Karpis into the man he was, that her cunning had made the gang nearly unstoppable. It was absurd, but no one dared question him. The press printed his words as gospel. Meanwhile, America was moving on. A new kind of criminal was emerging, more organized, more businesslike. The era of the wild outlaw was giving way to the age of the syndicate. The Italian mafia, the Chicago outfit, the crime families of New York. These were the new rulers of the underworld. The Barker gang seemed like a relic of a bygone age, a violent echo from a more desperate time. Yet even as their names faded from the headlines, the story of Ma Barker remained strangely resilient. It was too dramatic, too shocking to forget. Hollywood came calling. The first film adaptation of her story appeared in the early 1940s, a melodrama loosely inspired by the FBI's account. It portrayed Ma as a cold, manipulative woman who used her sons like chess pieces, pushing them toward murder and robbery for her own gain. The movie was a hit. Audiences couldn't get enough of the idea of a mother who had traded love for power, who had turned family into a weapon. It was pure fiction, but it struck a chord. The image of Ma Barker as the ultimate criminal matriarch became cemented in the public consciousness. By the 1950s, her legend had taken on almost mythological proportions. She was no longer just a criminal. She was a symbol, a warning about the dangers of moral decay, of mothers who spoiled their sons, of women who overstepped their roles. It was no accident that in the post-war years, when America was trying to rebuild its ideals of domesticity and family, Ma Barker became the embodiment of everything a mother wasn't supposed to be. She had defied the boundaries of womanhood, not by ambition or ideology, but by sheer defiance of social order. She had raised killers instead of citizens. The culture needed her story to stay alive because it made people feel safer to believe that evil could be explained, that it could be contained within a single monstrous figure. But to those who cared to look deeper, her story revealed something darker about the society that had condemned her. Ma Barker was, in many ways, the product of the same America that destroyed her. She was born into poverty, raised in a world where women had few choices and even fewer voices. Her sons grew up in an economy that crushed the poor and rewarded the ruthless. They were the children of failure, not personal failure, but systemic failure. When the law came for them, it didn't just punish them for their crimes. It punished them for who they were, poor, uneducated, and defiant. By the time Hoover's men fired those bullets into the walls of the Lake Weir house, Ma Barker had already been condemned in the eyes of the public. The gunfire was just a formality, the final punctuation on a story that had already been written. The real tragedy wasn't that she died in that house. It was that she never had a chance to tell her side of the story. No courtroom, no testimony, no defense, just a hail of bullets and a headline. In later years, when declassified FBI documents began to surface, historians started to notice the cracks in the official version. There was no evidence that Ma had planned any of the gang's crimes. No letters, no coded messages, no confessions. The FBI's reports were vague, filled with speculation and hearsay. Even the details of the shootout didn't fully add up. Some agents claimed she fired a machine gun. Others said she didn't fire at all. The weapon supposedly found beside her body had no fingerprints. Still, the Bureau's story stood unchallenged for decades, protected by Hoover's legacy and the public's appetite for simple villains. Alvin Karpis, in his later years, became one of the few people willing to speak openly about what had really happened. In his memoirs, he described Ma not as a criminal mastermind, but as a woman who loved her boys too much. He recalled how she would scold them for drinking too much, How she'd beg them to be careful before a job. How she'd cry when they didn't come home. She didn't know half of what we were doing, he wrote. She just liked being with us. It made her feel wanted. But his words came too late. The myth had already swallowed the truth whole. By the 1970s, Ma Barker's image had become a pop culture archetype. She appeared in comic books, television shows, and films, sometimes played for horror, sometimes for comedy. In one portrayal, she was shown as a leather-clad gangster queen, pistol in hand, sneering as her sons followed her orders. In another, she was depicted as a deranged old woman barking commands like a military general. None of them were accurate, but accuracy didn't matter anymore. She had become folklore, a cautionary ghost haunting the American dream. And yet there's something hauntingly human about her story that refuses to fade. Behind every exaggerated headline, behind every Hollywood caricature, there remains that image of a mother sitting beside her son in a house by a lake, refusing to leave him even when the world outside is ready to destroy them both. That image, not the machine gun or the legend, but the quiet defiance of love, is what gives her story its lasting power. Because deep down we understand what she felt. We understand the desperation of trying to hold on to family when everything else is slipping away. In the end, Ma Barker's life became a reflection of America's own contradictions, its fascination with outlaws, its hunger for heroes, and its need to turn complex people into simple symbols. She was both villain and victim, both myth and mother. And maybe that's why her story still echoes today. Because in her, we see a truth that makes us uncomfortable, that love, when twisted by desperation, can be just as dangerous as hate. Her grave lies in Welch, Missouri, beside Fred's. The headstones are plain. The inscription's simple. There are no flowers, no grand memorials. Tourists rarely visit. Most people drive past without knowing the story of the woman buried there. But every now and then, someone stops. A historian, a curious traveler, a descendant of those who once lived near her hometown. And they stand in the silence, wondering who she really was. And maybe that's all the justice she'll ever get. The question, not the answer. Because in the end, the truth about Ma Barker isn't something that can be proven or disproven. It lives in the space between myth and memory, in the whispers of those who still tell her story by firelight or in hushed tones. The woman who once ruled the headlines now belongs to history's gray shadows, not as a monster or a saint, but as something more real, a mother who loved too much, who lost everything and who became immortal because of it. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Ma Barker's story had evolved from history into legend, from fact into folklore. The world had changed so much since her death that the America she once knew would have been unrecognizable. The dusty roads her sons once raced down in stolen Fords were now covered in asphalt, and the small towns that once trembled at the mention of her family's name were quieter, older, tamer. Yet her legend refused to die. It lived on in whispers, in retellings, in the pages of crime magazines that mixed half-truths with pure invention. She had become a ghost that America couldn't stop talking about, a woman who had outlived the truth. Her story had become a reflection of whatever era was telling it. In the 1930s, she was a cautionary tale about the chaos of crime and the need for law and order. In the 1950s, she was a warning about the dangers of broken families and bad mothers. And by the 1980s, she had become something else entirely, a symbol of rebellion, of defiance, of a world that refused to be tamed. The counterculture had claimed her in a strange way. Punk bands used her name, artists painted her image in neon colors, and underground films depicted her as a folk hero, a kind of criminal feminist who fought back against a system that wanted her to disappear. None of these versions were accurate, but all of them spoke to something deeper. The enduring fascination with the idea of a woman who refused to bow to authority. It was almost poetic. The very system that had demonized her had accidentally made her immortal. Hoover's propaganda, designed to destroy her reputation, had instead given her a story that would outlive him by generations. While his name faded into dusty history books, hers kept resurfacing, reshaped again and again by artists, writers, and filmmakers. Every few years, a new movie or television series would emerge, reimagining the legend. Some portrayed her as a calculating matriarch with a cigarette in her hand and a plan in her eyes. Others as a tender-hearted mother trapped in a life she never chose. The truth sat quietly between those two extremes, ignored but never forgotten. In the small Missouri town where she had once lived, old-timers would still tell stories about her family. They'd talk about the days when the Barker boys were just troublemaking kids, riding bikes down dirt roads, stealing apples from orchards, getting into fights at the local school. They'd say how Ma, then known simply as Arizona Clark Barker, would storm into the schoolhouse, scolding teachers for punishing her sons and insisting her boys were good boys. It was the same fierce loyalty that would later define her. The same blindness, too. When people remembered her, they remembered a mother who refused to give up on her sons, no matter what they did. Even decades after her death, that memory had power. Some locals claimed they could still feel her presence. There were stories of strange lights near the old Barker farm, of whispers in the wind when the night was still. Others swore they'd seen her ghost near Lake Weir, standing in the mist with her son Fred, staring out over the water. Whether those were just tales to spook tourists or genuine folklore didn't matter. The fact that people were still telling them was proof enough that she had become something more than human. She had become myth. But beyond the ghost stories and the pop culture portrayals, there were those who tried to bring back the truth. Historians began digging through archives, reading FBI files that had long been sealed away. What they found painted a far different picture from the one Hoover had sold to the public. The files revealed inconsistencies, contradictions, and even deliberate exaggerations. Agents had described her as harmless in earlier reports, a woman who kept house while her sons plotted crimes. Only after her death did the tone of those reports change, labeling her as a mastermind. It was a convenient shift, a way to justify the Bureau's actions. One historian called it a cover story written in gunsmoke. These revelations sparked new debates. Some argued that Ma Barker had been vilified because she was a woman in a man's world. The 1930s were not kind to women who stepped outside traditional roles, and the idea of a woman wielding power, even over criminals, was enough to make society recoil. To the men who built the myth, it was easier to label her evil than to admit that love and loyalty could drive a person to destruction. Others took a different view. They said she wasn't innocent, that even if she hadn't planned the crimes, she had still chosen to live off their proceeds, still chosen to harbor fugitives, still chosen to stand beside her sons even as they spilled blood. They argued that she may not have pulled the trigger, but she didn't stop the bullets either. The truth, as always, lay tangled somewhere in between, and perhaps that's what keeps her story alive. The uncertainty, the contradictions, the impossibility of knowing who she really was. Every time someone tries to define her, she slips away like smoke. Was she a criminal or a victim? A manipulator or a mother? A woman destroyed by her sons, or the one who destroyed them? Each retelling adds another layer, another version of the same ghost. In the 1990s, her story took another strange turn when a small museum in Missouri decided to honor her. Not as a hero, but as a historical figure worth remembering. They displayed photographs, newspaper clippings, and even replicas of her letters. Tourists came, fascinated not just by her crimes, but by the question that had haunted her name for decades: how much of it was true? Some left the museum convinced she had been framed by history. Others left sure she was exactly what Hoover had claimed, a cold-blooded criminal who got what she deserved. But all of them left talking about her, and that, in its own way, was a kind of victory. Meanwhile, in the world of popular culture, her name was being used in ways she never could have imagined. Rock bands referenced her in lyrics. Filmmakers turned her into a symbol of outlaw femininity. One particularly popular song called her the Queen of Crime, a line that romanticized her legend even as it distorted it further. The real Ma Barker had lived and died in fear, but the version now living in people's minds was fearless, invincible. It was a strange kind of immortality, one she never asked for, but one she'd earned nonetheless. For those who studied the psychology of crime, Ma Barker became a case study in what they called maternal complicity. Professors lectured about her in criminology classes, analyzing how love could become a form of control, how protection could turn into destruction. They used her as an example of how family bonds could twist under pressure, how morality could bend in the name of loyalty. But for all their theories, none of them could explain the simple human truth of her story, that she couldn't let her sons go. That was her crime, and her punishment was to die beside one of them. The world watching, the truth forever lost in the sound of gunfire. Even now, decades later, that image remains powerful. a mother and son, barricaded in a lakeside house, refusing to surrender. The world outside calling for them to give up. But inside, there is only silence and stubborn love. The bullets come, and the story ends. But the echoes never fade. Every generation rediscovers her in its own way. In the 2000s, true crime documentaries revisited the case, questioning Hoover's narrative and giving voice to those who believed she had been wronged. Podcast hosts dissected her life, tracing her story from the poverty of Missouri to the final gunfight in Florida. Listeners were drawn not just to the violence but to the humanity behind it. The mother who loved too much, the family that fell apart in the name of loyalty. In a world obsessed with crime stories, Ma Barker's tale stood out not for its brutality, but for its heartache. It wasn't just about greed or power. It was about love gone wrong. The more time passed, the more her story began to resemble a tragedy rather than a crime saga. A Shakespearean kind of fall, where every decision was both understandable and unforgivable. If she had turned her sons in, she would have lost them. If she had stood by them, she would die with them. Either way, the ending was written long before the first bullet was fired. Today, nearly a century after her death, Ma Barker's name still sparks arguments. Some call her a feminist icon, an early symbol of a woman defying male control. Others call her a cautionary tale about the dangers of misplaced love. But in the quiet places, away from the noise of historians and storytellers, she remains what she always was, a mother whose story was taken from her and rewritten by men who needed a villain. Somewhere. If the afterlife has room for irony, Ma Barker is probably watching all this unfold with that same sly smile she used to give her sons when they thought they were being clever. Maybe she laughs at how the world still can't make up its mind about her. Maybe she doesn't care. Maybe, after everything, she finally has what she always wanted, to be remembered, to never be forgotten. Because in the end, that's the strange beauty of her story. The FBI tried to erase her by turning her into a caricature, but instead they gave her eternal life. Every retelling, every movie, every song, every whisper keeps her alive, walking the thin line between sinner and saint. She may have died in 1935, but Ma Barker, the legend, the ghost, the myth, never did. As the years stretched on, Ma Barker's story began to take on a strange new life of its own, no longer confined to the yellowed pages of old newspapers or the whispers of history buffs. It began surfacing in the most unexpected places, in Hollywood boardrooms, in late-night radio shows, in college lecture halls. Every storyteller who picked up her name seemed to see something different in it. Some saw danger and rebellion. Others saw tragedy and sacrifice. The truth was too complicated for easy labels, and that was exactly what kept her story alive. The world couldn't stop talking about the woman who'd been branded both a monster and a martyr. In the mid-20th century, filmmakers discovered Ma Barker's tale like a treasure buried beneath the dust of time. The post-war world had a hunger for stories of crime and rebellion, and hers fit perfectly into that cultural craving. The first few portrayals were crude, almost theatrical. She was shown as a snarling matriarch, a woman who beat her sons into becoming killers. One film in particular, released in the 1950s, painted her as the very embodiment of corruption, a devil in a floral dress, leading her sons to hell with a shotgun in hand. The movie posters showed her sneering, her hair wild, her eyes full of fury. Beneath her name were the words, "The most dangerous woman America ever created." It was sensational, exploitative and wildly successful. Audiences flocked to see it, fascinated by this blend of truth and fantasy. The filmmakers didn't care much for accuracy. They wanted emotion, spectacle, shock value, and they got it. But behind the dramatized violence and the Hollywood glamour, something strange began to happen. People started to question who she really was. Some left the theaters feeling uneasy, wondering if maybe the story had gone too far. Maybe she hadn't been the puppet master at all. Maybe she was just another victim of her son's choices, swept into their storm and too proud to walk away. The fascination deepened in the decades that followed. The counterculture movements of the 1960s and 70s began reclaiming figures like Ma Barker, not as villains, but as anti-heroes. In an age that distrusted authority, her defiance became something to admire. She was reimagined as a symbol of rebellion, a woman who refused to bow to men, to government, to control. Her outlaw sons were painted as symbols of freedom in a society obsessed with conformity. The irony, of course, was that Ma Barker herself had never thought of herself as rebellious. She wasn't trying to change the system. She just wanted her family to survive, to stay together in a world that kept tearing them apart. But history doesn't always care about the truth. It only cares about the story that resonates. By the 1980s, the line between myth and fact was almost completely erased. True crime magazines and television specials ran exaggerated features about her. They called her the grandmother of organized crime, suggesting she had mentored half the outlaws of the Depression era. They printed fabricated letters where she supposedly gave orders to her sons or negotiated with mobsters. It didn't matter that none of it was real. The more sensational the story, the more people believed it. And as the legend grew, so did the questions. What kind of woman could turn her home into a den of thieves? What kind of mother could sleep peacefully while her sons plotted kidnappings and murders? But there were others, quiet voices in the background, trying to rewrite the narrative. Independent researchers, journalists, and even a few surviving relatives began piecing together the truth. They uncovered police reports, letters, photographs, evidence that painted a different picture entirely. The real Ma Barker was no mastermind. She was an enabler, yes, but also a woman out of her depth, swept along by her son's ambition. One historian described her as a mother who mistook love for loyalty and paid for it with her life. It was a haunting description, one that captured the complexity of her story more than any headline ever could. Her surviving family members lived in the long shadow of that name. Some changed their last names, moved far away, tried to start over. Others embraced the legend, turning it into a strange kind of inheritance. One distant relative even opened a roadside attraction called Ma's Hideout, filled with fake artifacts and dramatic retellings of the Barker Gang's final stand. It was equal parts tribute and performance, the line between reality and showmanship completely blurred. Tourists came by the busload, snapping photos in front of life-sized mannequins of Ma and Fred. They listened to sound effects of machine gun fire and the echo of sirens, while a recorded voice told them about the most dangerous mother in America. It was grotesque and fascinating at the same time. The commercialization of a tragedy turned into entertainment. And yet, in all of that noise, there were still moments when the humanity of her story slipped through. Letters she had written to her sons surfaced in archives. Letters filled not with commands or plans, but with motherly advice. She told them to eat well, to take care of themselves, to be careful on the road. In one, she even scolded Fred for spending too much money on whiskey. They weren't the words of a criminal mastermind. They were the words of a worried mother, desperate to keep her boys close, even as the world fell apart around them. Reading those letters decades later, it was impossible not to feel the ache of her love, warped though it was. There's a tragic universality in her story. Strip away the gunfire, the robberies, the FBI chase, and what's left is something heartbreakingly human. A mother who couldn't let go. That's what makes her legend endure. We all recognize that part of her, the refusal to see the worst in the people we love. Ma Barker's fatal flaw wasn't greed or violence. It was devotion. She believed her sons were her world, and that belief destroyed her. But if there's one thing that history has shown, it's that legends have a way of consuming their creators. The name Ma Barker eventually became bigger than the woman herself. It was used to sell movies, books, even Halloween costumes. It became shorthand for a certain kind of villainy, a mix of maternal warmth and cold-blooded ruthlessness. The truth of her life was drowned beneath that tide of exaggeration. When people thought of her, they saw not the aging mother in a Florida cottage, but the mythic figure holding a Tommy gun defying the world. In more recent years, efforts have been made to reclaim her story with empathy and accuracy. Biographers have gone back through the evidence, comparing testimony, rewriting timelines. Some have even interviewed descendants of the FBI agents involved in her death. What they found often contradicted the Bureau's official version. There were signs that the story of the final gunfight had been embellished, that maybe Ma and Fred hadn't even fired back. Some claimed she never even held a weapon that day. If true, it made her death not an act of violent defiance, but one of quiet tragedy, a woman caught in the crossfire of her own son's choices and the government's need for a victory. That revelation reshaped the way many saw her. She wasn't just a villain anymore. She was a victim of circumstance, of loyalty, of a world that demanded a scapegoat. Hoover's FBI needed to justify its growing power. and Ma Barker, an old woman with a notorious name, was the perfect target. It was easier to paint her as the enemy than to admit that the Bureau had killed a mother who might have been innocent of everything except love. Today, historians still argue over the details. Some insist she knew exactly what her sons were doing and helped them plan their crimes. Others maintain she was nothing more than a mother who cooked meals for outlaws and refused to turn them in. The debate will never be settled completely, and maybe that's the point. Maybe her story isn't supposed to be clear-cut. Maybe it's meant to be a mirror, reflecting our own fears and desires, the way we project meaning onto those who live outside society's rules. And somewhere in all of this, there's something deeply American about her story. The rise and fall, the blurred lines between hero and villain. The idea that fame and infamy can sometimes be the same thing. Ma Barker's name still echoes through the country's cultural memory because she represents something larger than herself. The motherly instinct twisted by desperation. The love that turns dangerous when pushed too far. Her life is a reminder that sometimes evil isn't born out of malice, but out of devotion taken to its breaking point. Even now, if you travel to the shores of Lake Weir in Florida, where that final stand took place, the air feels heavy with history. The old house is long gone, but locals say that when the sun sets and the wind blows through the trees, you can almost hear the faint echo of gunfire, the shouts of FBI agents, the voice of a mother calling out to her son. Some swear they've seen her figure in the mist, small, gray-haired, standing by the water, looking out toward the horizon. Maybe it's just imagination, or maybe some stories never really die. Ma Barker's tale lingers not because of what she did, but because of what she represents. She was both villain and victim, saint and sinner. Her name became a warning, a legend, a song whispered across generations. The FBI could end her life, but they couldn't kill her myth. That belonged to the people, to the storytellers, the dreamers, the ones who see beauty in tragedy and tragedy in love. She has become part of America's dark mythology, standing beside Bonnie and Clyde, Al Capone, and John Dillinger in the pantheon of outlaws who refuse to fade quietly into history. If you listen closely, you can still hear her story being told in dimly lit bars, in podcasts, in smoky back rooms where people trade tales of the old days. Each version is a little different, but the essence remains the same. A mother who loved her sons so fiercely it destroyed them all. As the years turned into decades, Ma Barker's name became something of a shadow that stretched across time. A whisper in America's long and complicated conversation with its own past. She was no longer just a woman who had lived and died in the chaos of the 1930s. She was an idea, a reflection of how society viewed women, crime, and power. Every era reinterpreted her story in its own image, twisting it into something that fit the times. And with each retelling, the truth slipped further away, buried beneath layers of speculation, myth, and moral judgment. By the early 2000s, when true crime documentaries and internet forums began to dominate public imagination, Ma Barker found herself resurrected once again. This time, her story was filtered through digital obsession. Online sleuths debated every photograph, every line from old FBI reports, every rumor that had ever been printed. Some believed she was innocent, a victim of Hoover's media manipulation. Others insisted she was far more dangerous than the government ever revealed. The debates were fierce, emotional, and relentless. It seemed that even in death, she couldn't rest. For many, the fascination came not from her crimes, but from her contradictions. She was a mother and a criminal, a nurturer and an enabler. That paradox made her magnetic. People wanted to understand her, to dissect what kind of woman could nurture both love and lawlessness under the same roof. Her story raised questions that went far beyond crime. It touched on the human condition itself. How far will love go before it becomes destruction? How much control does a parent really have over the destiny of their children? And what happens when morality and family loyalty collide? The renewed interest brought forward historians who wanted to separate myth from truth once and for all. One such researcher, a woman named Ellen McLean, dedicated nearly 10 years of her life to studying the Barker family. She combed through court records, handwritten notes, and forgotten newspaper archives. What she found painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and deeply human. Ma Barker, she discovered, had grown up poor in the rugged heart of Missouri, where survival was an everyday battle. She married young to a man who provided little stability. When her sons came into the world, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, and Fred, they became her life. her only sense of purpose in a world that offered her nothing else. McLean's research showed that Ma wasn't the manipulative genius Hoover had described, but neither was she completely innocent. She turned a blind eye to what her sons became, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of love. She moved from town to town with them, not because she was leading their crimes, but because she couldn't bear to be apart from them. It was a quiet kind of complicity, born from loneliness and devotion. To her, her sons were all she had. The world had taken everything else, yet the public rarely saw that side of her. Hollywood had no use for nuance. The image of a Tommy gun-toting mother, snarling commands from behind a curtain of cigarette smoke, was far more profitable. That image had been burned into America's imagination, and no amount of historical accuracy could erase it. Even today, when people hear her name, they picture a woman with wild eyes and a cold heart, orchestrating robberies and murders with ruthless precision. It's a fiction that refuses to die, because it's so much more thrilling than the truth. Still, in the quiet corners of the internet, a new generation began reclaiming her story. Independent filmmakers and podcasters began exploring her life with more empathy, more curiosity. They asked not just what she did, but why. They questioned the role of poverty, of desperation, of gender, and of love, twisted into something dangerous. Their portrayals were softer, sadder, and far more real. In these retellings, Ma Barker wasn't a villain. She was a tragedy. The FBI's own files, when they became publicly available, revealed details that had been carefully hidden from the public for decades. Agents' notes from the field painted her as a quiet woman who mostly cooked meals and kept house. One report even described her as timid and old-fashioned. None of the documents from before the deadly standoff referred to her as the gang's leader. Only after her death did the narrative shift. Hoover himself edited and released statements emphasizing her leadership role, knowing that the image of a criminal matriarch would make for sensational headlines. It was the perfect story to justify the Bureau's growing power, a victory against evil, a triumph of law and order. The truth, however, was that it was as much a public relations campaign as a law enforcement operation. When historians confronted these findings, they realized how deeply embedded the myth had become. Even knowing the truth, it was hard to separate the woman from the legend. The legend was too dramatic, too cinematic to let go. That's the irony of Ma Barker's legacy. She became a creation of the very machine that sought to destroy her. Hoover had turned her into a monster, and that monster proved to be immortal. In the small towns of Missouri and Arkansas, where the Barkers had once roamed, there are still locals who claim to be distantly related to the family. Some refuse to talk about it. Others embrace it with pride, telling stories passed down through generations. They say Ma wasn't evil, just misunderstood. They say she loved her boys, that she never held a gun, that she was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The truth, they insist, died with her in that Florida cottage. Maybe they're right. Maybe no one will ever know for sure. What's undeniable, though, is that Ma Barker's story captures something essential about America itself, a country that both worships and condemns its outlaws. Americans have always been fascinated by rebellion, by those who defy authority and live on their own terms. From Jesse James to Bonnie and Clyde, from Dillinger to Capone, the outlaws of history have become folk heroes. Ma Barker, the dangerous mother, fit perfectly into that mythology. She was different, though. Her weapon wasn't her gun, it was her love. And that made her story even more haunting. By the 2010s, her legend had gone global. Streaming platforms and documentary series introduced her story to new audiences around the world. Viewers in Europe, Asia, and South America watched reenactments of her life, drawn in by the tragic spectacle of a mother consumed by her son's crimes. For some, it was their first time hearing her name. For others, it was a rediscovery of an old American ghost. The filmmakers portrayed her not as a criminal genius, but as a broken woman in over her head, clinging to a family that had long since fallen apart. It was the closest anyone had come to portraying the truth, though even then the line between fact and fiction remained blurred. What makes her story endure is its emotional power. Even stripped of its sensationalism, it still resonates deeply. We all understand love, and we all understand how love can become something dangerous when it blinds us to reality. Ma Barker's life is a study in that transformation. Her love was her strength and her undoing. It's what made her protect her sons, what made her defy the law, what made her stand beside Fred until the very end. It's what made her name echo through history. If one were to look at her final moments not as an ending, but as a symbol, they would see something profoundly tragic. A mother and son facing the world together, knowing they were doomed, refusing to surrender. It's the kind of image that feels almost poetic. In that house by Lake Weir, amid the smoke and gunfire, Ma Barker's story became immortal. It was no longer about crime or justice. It became about love, loyalty, and the terrible cost of both. In modern discussions of true crime, where stories are dissected with both fascination and moral scrutiny, Ma Barker's name continues to stir debate. She stands as a symbol of how easily the lines blur between truth and storytelling, between justice and propaganda. She reminds us how history can be shaped, not by facts, but by the people who write them. Her name lives not because of who she truly was, but because of what she represents, the enduring struggle between perception and reality. Every few years, a new documentary or podcast revisits her life, each claiming to tell the real story. Yet none of them can capture the whole truth because the whole truth no longer exists. It's scattered across decades of rumors, news articles, police files, and film scripts. Each version adds something, takes something away, and maybe that's fitting. Maybe Ma Barker was never meant to be understood completely. Maybe she was meant to haunt the spaces between myth and memory, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous stories are the ones we think we know. There's something eerie about that. The idea that a person can die, and yet their story can go on changing forever. That's what happened to her. Her life ended in gunfire, but her story became a living thing, reshaped by every generation that retold it. Each storyteller added a little of themselves to it: fear, fascination, sympathy, judgment. She became a mirror, reflecting not who she was, but who we are. And so, as the world moves further from the 1930s, Ma Barker remains frozen in that moment. Standing in the window of that Florida house, her shadow cast long across history. Some will always see a criminal mastermind. Others will see a mother destroyed by her own love. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, hidden beneath the noise of decades. But whatever she was, one thing is certain: she will never be forgotten. Her story, however twisted and retold, belongs to the ages now. The air was thick with tension in the Barker household. Inside their safe house, somewhere deep in the swamplands of Florida, the once proud Ma Barker sat in a worn-out chair, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Around her were the remnants of the life she had built: maps, weapons, stacks of newspapers detailing their crimes, and a radio that buzzed with reports of a nationwide manhunt. The Barker-Karpis Gang had become a target too large to ignore. The FBI, led by J. Edgar Hoover himself, had made their capture a matter of national pride. But for Ma, it wasn't fear that lingered in her eyes. It was reflection. She knew the end was coming. The world she had built, of loyalty, of blood, of crime, was closing in on itself, and she could almost feel the ground trembling under the weight of her own past. Outside, the men were restless. Fred Barker, her loyal son and the last of her boys left by her side, paced near the window, his hand on the trigger of his Tommy gun. "They'll come soon, Ma," he muttered, peering through the slits of the blinds. The Florida sun poured in, harsh and unforgiving, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like ghosts. "They'll come and we'll be ready." Ma looked at him, her heart tightening. She had seen this before: men cornered, desperate, believing they still had a chance when the truth was already sealed. The FBI had tracked them down using letters and witness accounts. The safe house in Ocklawaha was no longer safe. The neighbors had noticed the strangers who came and went, the fancy cars that rolled up at odd hours. And so the net closed, inch by inch, like a snake tightening around its prey. Fred was her favorite, the one who had stayed loyal even when his brothers had drifted or died. Arthur "Doc" Barker had already been caught months before, ambushed in Chicago. He was rotting in Alcatraz now. Lloyd had tried to go straight after prison, only to be shot dead by his own wife. Herman, the oldest, had blown his brains out years ago when police cornered him in a gunfight. Fred was all she had left, her last son, her last thread to the world she had created. She wasn't going to let him die without a fight. The sound of boots crunching outside broke the silence. Both mother and son froze. Fred raised his gun instinctively. Ma reached for her revolver. Through the small gaps between the shutters, they could see shadows moving, men positioning themselves in the trees, behind cars, across the field that led to the house. It was the FBI. The siege had begun. But before we reached the roar of gunfire that would end it all, we need to step back to understand how the Barker gang had found themselves at this point. The years leading up to that Florida standoff were drenched in blood, fear, and betrayal. After the major kidnappings of Edward Bremer and William Hamm, the Barker-Karpis gang had reached its zenith. Those crimes brought in massive ransoms, but they also brought relentless heat. Hoover had made it personal. Ma Barker and her boys are the most vicious, dangerous criminals in America, he had declared. The words echoed through radio broadcasts and newspapers nationwide, painting her as the puppet master behind every crime. Whether that was truth or myth, the public didn't care. The legend of America's most dangerous mother had already taken root. In truth, Ma was not the strategic mastermind the papers made her out to be. She was something more primal, more dangerous in a way that couldn't be measured by criminal plans or heists. She was the emotional engine, the mother who refused to let go, who wrapped her boys so tightly in her own identity that they couldn't escape even if they wanted to. Alvin Karpis, the brains of the operation, had once described her as a mean old woman who loved her boys too much. He was right. She wasn't plotting robberies. She was holding her sons together through them. Every time they talked about splitting, she reminded them of their blood, of how no one else in the world would ever be loyal. That loyalty, that twisted version of love, was the glue that held their gang, and ultimately their fate, together. As the 1930s wore on, the Barker-Karpis Gang became the most wanted criminal outfit in America. They had everything: money, hideouts across the Midwest, corrupt connections, and notoriety that rivaled Dillinger and Bonnie and Clyde. But fame was a curse in the underworld. With every headline, every whisper of their names, law enforcement drew closer. Ma's sons began to fracture under the pressure. Doc was volatile, unpredictable, and jealous of Karpis's influence. Fred was loyal, but increasingly paranoid. Karpis himself, the careful planner, was growing frustrated with Ma's presence. He often complained that she was a liability, loud, nosy, and fond of whiskey-fueled rants. But Fred would hear none of it. "You talk about my Ma again, Karpis," he warned once, "and I'll make you regret it." That was all Ma needed to hear. In her mind, Fred was still her boy, her brave, loyal boy who would protect her against the world. By 1935, the walls were closing in. The FBI had captured or killed most of the big-name criminals of the Depression era. Dillinger was dead. Pretty Boy Floyd was dead. Babyface Nelson was dead. Hoover wanted the same ending for the Barkers. When Doc was captured, the gang splintered. Karpis went into hiding with a few loyal associates. Fred and Ma fled south, first to Louisiana, then to Florida, under the aliases Mr. and Mrs. T.C. Blackburn. They rented a lakeside cottage in Ocklawaha, a quiet town where no one asked too many questions. For a while, it seemed like they might fade away into obscurity. Fred would go fishing, Ma would cook, and the two would sit on the porch at dusk, listening to the insects hum. For the first time in years, there was peace. But peace, in their world, was always temporary. The FBI traced them there through a series of letters Ma had written to another son. Her affection, her downfall, was what gave them away. The agents moved in quietly at dawn on January 16, 1935. Surrounded by more than a dozen men armed with rifles and machine guns, the house became a fortress under siege. The first shots came from Fred, a short burst through the window. The FBI responded in kind, and soon the quiet Florida morning erupted into chaos. Bullets tore through the walls, splintered furniture, and shattered glass. The sound of gunfire echoed across the lake. The standoff lasted for hours, 5 long, deafening hours of smoke and screams and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Inside, Ma shouted encouragements to her son, firing blindly toward the windows. "Don't let them take you, Freddie," she yelled. "We'll die before we go in." Neighbors who lived miles away later said they could hear the gunfire, the sound of a war being fought in that tiny cottage. When the shooting finally stopped, silence fell heavy over the smoke-filled ruins. Agents moved cautiously toward the house, their guns raised. They kicked down the door and stepped into the wreckage. There, lying side by side, were Fred Barker and his mother. Both were riddled with bullets. Ma's hand still clutched her revolver. The newspapers the next morning called it the end of America's most dangerous gang. But even in death, the myth of Ma Barker only grew. Hoover personally gave statements claiming she had orchestrated the gang's crimes, that she had been the mastermind. Karpis would later scoff at that version of history, calling it nonsense. Ma couldn't plan breakfast, he said in an interview decades later. But she was tough, and she loved her boys like no one else. Whether or not she was truly the gang's leader doesn't matter as much as what she represented. She became a symbol of something darker. A mother's love turned into obsession, loyalty warped into destruction. The story of Ma Barker was no longer just about crime. It was about the boundaries of love and control, how one woman's refusal to let go of her sons pulled them all into the abyss. The FBI, of course, paraded her death as a triumph of justice. They posed for photos outside the bullet-riddled cottage, trophies of victory held in their eyes. But somewhere in that there was tragedy. For all her flaws, Ma Barker was still a mother who wanted to protect her family in a world that had long since stopped showing mercy. Years later, tourists would come to see the old house to take pictures of the bullet holes, to stand where America's most wanted mother had made her final stand. They didn't see the real woman, the one who cooked meals for her boys, who laughed with them, who believed they could be invincible. They saw only the legend, the monster that Hoover created. But maybe that's how all gangsters' stories end, not in truth, but in myth. A mother's love turned into a national nightmare, a family name etched in blood and infamy. As the sun set over the Florida swamp that evening, the agents packed up their gear and drove away, leaving behind 2 bodies and a story that would echo through the decades. The lake grew quiet again, the water still. Somewhere in that silence, the ghost of Ma Barker lingered, still watching over her lost sons. She had lived for them, fought for them, and died beside them. And in her mind, maybe that was victory. The story of Ma Barker didn't end with the echo of gunfire that morning in Ocklawaha. Death has a way of birthing legends, and in Ma's case, the legend grew even louder than the reality she had lived. Within hours of her body being discovered, reporters swarmed the scene like vultures. They wanted blood, not truth. The photographs of the cottage, riddled with holes and soaked in smoke, were splashed across every front page in America. "Public enemy number 1, Ma Barker killed in gun battle," screamed the headlines. The newspapers painted her as a ruthless matriarch who had commanded her sons like soldiers in a war against society. They called her the mastermind, the evil mother, the brains behind the Barker-Karpis Gang. But those who knew her, really knew her, whispered a different story. They spoke of a woman who could barely read, who had no idea how to plan a heist, who was too soft on her boys to ever command them. Yet the myth stuck. It was cleaner, more sensational, more satisfying to a country that wanted heroes and villains. In Washington, J. Edgar Hoover sat in his office looking at the reports with satisfaction. This was his era, his stage. The FBI had been under pressure to prove its worth, to show the American people that it could protect them from the chaos of crime that had defined the Depression years. Dillinger, Nelson, Floyd, they were all trophies in Hoover's cabinet. But Ma Barker was different. She wasn't just another outlaw. She was a symbol of moral decay, of the family-turned-criminal. By making her the face of evil, Hoover gave America something to hate, something to fear, and something to rally against. She was the most vicious, dangerous criminal mind we've ever come across, he told the press, his sharp eyes glinting behind wire-rimmed glasses. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was that it sounded like justice. As the news spread, Americans couldn't stop talking about her. Housewives in small towns read the papers and shook their heads. "A mother?" they'd whisper. "How could a mother do that to her sons?" The irony, of course, was that Ma had done it all for her sons. In her mind, there had never been a line between love and crime. Every robbery, every hideout, every bullet fired was wrapped in the belief that she was protecting them. She was born into poverty, raised in a world where the law existed only to keep people like her down. The idea that her boys could rise above it, through crime or cunning, was intoxicating. The money gave them respect, power, and a sense of belonging. For Ma, that was enough. She didn't see the danger creeping in, the slow decay that came with living outside the law for too long. Or maybe she did see it but chose to ignore it, believing that her love could shield them from everything. In the months after her death, the FBI continued to hunt down the remaining members of the Barker-Karpis Gang. Alvin Karpis, the last man standing, managed to stay ahead of the law for a while longer. But even he couldn't outrun the inevitable. In 1936, he was finally captured in New Orleans, arrested by Hoover himself. They posed for photographs together, Hoover with his immaculate suit, Karpis with his sharp, tired eyes, and that photo became another symbol of Hoover's crusade. Karpis was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Alcatraz, where he would spend decades behind bars. But even he couldn't escape the shadow of Ma Barker. In interviews years later, he would be asked about her again and again. Was she really the boss? They'd ask. And every time Karpis would laugh. The boss? He'd say. Ma didn't plan nothing. She couldn't even drive a car. Yet he always spoke of her with a strange, quiet respect, like a man who had seen the worst of her but still understood the love that drove her madness. The Barker name became legend. Hollywood came calling soon after. In the years that followed, films and pulp novels turned Ma Barker into a symbol of the criminal mother, a twisted take on maternal devotion. In one movie, she was shown holding a Tommy gun, barking orders to her sons like a general. In another, she was portrayed as cold and cunning, a woman who manipulated her children into a life of crime for her own gain. None of it was true, but that didn't matter. America wanted stories, not accuracy. Ma Barker became a character, a monster and martyr rolled into one. She was the cautionary tale of a mother's love gone wrong, a villain whose story carried the weight of moral warning. In small towns across the Midwest, older folks would still whisper her name when telling stories to their children. "You mind your mama," they'd say. "Or you'll end up like those Barker boys." In a strange way, Ma's ghost became a tool of parenting, a reminder of the consequences of rebellion and sin. But there were others, especially among the poor, who saw her differently. To them, she was a kind of folk hero, a woman who had fought the system, who had stood by her sons against the government, who had refused to bow. The truth was, somewhere in between. She wasn't a hero or a monster. She was a woman shaped by her times, a time of desperation, of broken families, of a country trying to crawl out of the Great Depression by any means necessary. Back in Ocklawaha, the cottage where she died stood for years as a grim monument. People came from miles around to see it. They'd take photos, pick up small splinters of wood as souvenirs, and listen to locals recount the tale of the shootout. The bullet holes were left untouched, reminders of that 5-hour battle that had ended an era. Some visitors swore they could still feel her presence there, that on quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the trees and the frogs croaked, by the lake they could hear faint whispers, Ma's voice calling out to her boys, telling them to hold their ground. The legend gave the town an eerie fame, the kind that comes from tragedy. The cottage would eventually be dismantled, its pieces sold off, but its story would live on in photographs, in memory, and in myth. The Barker story had everything that made America obsessed with crime, family, betrayal, violence, and love twisted into something dark. It was a story that blurred the line between victim and villain, because in the end, what really destroyed Ma Barker wasn't greed or even law enforcement, it was loyalty. The same fierce devotion that kept her family together became the weight that dragged them all down. When you live for your children's sins, you die with them. That was Ma's tragedy. That was her legacy. Years later, historians would dig through FBI files and witness testimonies, trying to piece together the truth. Some said Hoover exaggerated her role to make his victory look greater. Others argued that she was far more cunning than people believed, that she might not have planned the crimes, but she certainly fueled them, pushing her sons to stay together and keep fighting. In truth, it's likely both were right. Ma Barker wasn't a criminal genius or a helpless bystander. She was something in between, a mother trying to hold her broken world together, blind to how much damage she was causing. Her story is one that forces people to confront uncomfortable questions. How far would you go to protect the people you love? And when does protection turn into destruction? If you strip away the guns, the getaways, and the headlines, what remains is a story of family, flawed, desperate, and doomed. Ma Barker's boys were born into poverty and pain, molded by a world that didn't offer much in the way of mercy. They grew up fighting for scraps, learning early that power was the only protection worth having. And when that hunger met a mother's boundless love, it created something combustible. Together they built an empire out of crime. Together, they burned it down. By the time the FBI loaded Ma and Fred's bodies into the back of a truck that January morning, the Barker legacy was already sealed. The agents didn't know it, but they weren't just ending a criminal career. They were giving birth to a myth that would outlive them all. Somewhere, perhaps in that final moment as the bullets tore through the cottage, Ma must have realized that. Maybe she saw her life flash before her. The young girl from Missouri who wanted better for her children, the mother who cheered when her boys brought home money without asking where it came from, the woman who stood beside them as the world called them monsters. Maybe, in that last heartbeat, she finally understood the price of her love. The wind carried the smoke away that morning, and with it, the last remnants of the Barker gang. But legends don't fade that easily. They linger, reshaped by time, retold in whispers and stories, growing larger than life. Ma Barker became a mirror of America itself, its hunger for power, its devotion to family, and its fascination with sin. She became a ghost in the collective imagination, a reminder that sometimes the people we fear most are the ones who loved the hardest. And so her story still echoes, through time and through the shadows of American history, a mother, her sons, and the law that finally caught up to them, a tale as tragic as it is timeless. The years after the Barker gang's bloody end became an era of storytelling, rewriting, and myth-making. Time, as it always does, began to blur the lines between truth and fiction until Ma Barker was no longer a woman, but a legend carved into the American consciousness. The newspapers had done their job well. Hoover had made sure of that. His agents spoke about her as if she were a criminal mastermind, a manipulative matron who had puppeteered her sons into a symphony of violence. The image was perfect for propaganda. The idea that evil could fester not in dark alleys or smoky bars, but within a home, in the arms of a mother who had turned her children into killers. It was shocking, it was thrilling, and it made for a story that America could not let go of. But behind the myth, the truth remained more human, more tragic, and far more complicated than the headlines ever cared to tell. Long before she was Ma Barker, Arizona Donnie Clark was just a young girl from the small town of Ash Grove, Missouri. Born into poverty in 1873, she grew up in a world that didn't forgive weakness. Her family worked hard, but there was never enough. Never enough money, never enough opportunity, never enough escape. She married George Barker at 19, and together they tried to build a life, raising 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, Doc, and Fred. George was a laborer, quiet and unremarkable, while Arizona, who everyone began calling Kate, was a fiery presence. She had a way of filling a room, commanding attention, even if she wasn't particularly educated. She wanted better for her boys, but the world they were born into didn't have much to offer them. The Midwest during those years was a place of droughts, broken dreams, and an undercurrent of anger toward the system. It's easy to look back now and see the seeds of what was coming. Herman, the oldest, was wild from the start, handsome, charming, and reckless. He stole cars before he was old enough to drive them. Lloyd wasn't far behind. Doc had a mean streak, a temper that could snap like dry wood. And Fred, the youngest, was Ma's favorite, soft-spoken but loyal, the kind of son who would do anything to please her. They grew up idolizing outlaws, the way boys today might idolize movie stars. Jesse James, the younger gang, these were their heroes. To the Barker boys, the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, those who took and those who got taken from. And Ma, whether she realized it or not, encouraged that view. When the law came knocking, she defended them. When they got in trouble, she made excuses. When they came home with stolen money, she didn't ask questions. Every mother protects her children, but Ma's protection came with blind devotion. By the 1920s, their crimes were getting bigger and more violent. Bank robberies, kidnappings, shootouts, each act drew them deeper into the underworld. When Herman died in a shootout with police in Wichita, blowing his own brains out rather than surrendering. Ma refused to believe he was at fault. She blamed the cops, the newspapers, anyone but her son. That denial became her armor, her coping mechanism. Every loss only drew her closer to the boys who remained, and in doing so, she became part of the machine. Wherever her sons went, she followed, St. Paul, Chicago, Tulsa, carrying her few belongings and her fierce sense of loyalty. She wasn't planning their crimes, but she was their home base, their refuge, their anchor. To them, she was the one constant in a world that kept turning against them. The Barker boys started running with bigger names: bank robbers, bootleggers, killers. It was in St. Paul that they met Alvin Karpis, a clever, cold-eyed criminal who saw in the Barkers an opportunity. Karpis was meticulous where the Barkers were impulsive, strategic where they were emotional. He became the brain of the operation, while Fred and Doc served as the muscle. Ma, by then in her late 50s, became the unlikely matron of the gang. She cooked, cleaned, and kept the boys in line. When the law was on their trail, she packed their things and moved them to a new safe house. She wasn't sitting in smoky rooms plotting robberies, but she was there, always there. Her presence as constant as the sound of the trains that carried them from one crime to the next. The press would later turn her into a monster, but the truth is more haunting. Ma Barker believed she was doing good. She believed that love meant never turning your back, never letting the world take your family away. That belief became her curse. When the FBI labeled her public enemy #1, she didn't even understand what it meant at first. She couldn't comprehend that she, an old woman who still wrote letters home and played cards with neighbors, had become one of the most wanted figures in America. The irony is that her notoriety made her sons more reckless. They wanted to live up to the legend. They started hitting bigger targets: banks, armored cars, even kidnappings. The money poured in, but so did the heat. Every successful job brought them closer to disaster. After the kidnappings of Ham and Bremer, the gang was swimming in ransom money but drowning in paranoia. The FBI was closing in, the Midwest was too hot, and even their old criminal allies were turning away. Fred and Ma fled south, while Doc tried to keep the remnants of the gang together. But trust was running thin. Karpis wanted to cut ties and disappear, to live quietly with his share of the money. Fred wouldn't hear of it. "We don't run," he told Karpis. "We fight." It was pride, it was love, it was desperation, and Ma, ever loyal, stood behind him. "We've been through worse," she said. "Ain't no G-man alive can take us." She said it like a mother comforting a child, but her words were more prophecy than comfort. The very next year, the FBI would prove her wrong. The standoff at Ocklawaha was not just the end of the Barker gang, it was the end of an era. America had grown tired of its outlaws. The Great Depression was fading, and the public's sympathy for gangsters was turning into disdain. People no longer saw them as rebels against a broken system, but as murderers who preyed on the innocent. The FBI's victory over Ma and Fred was more than a police operation. It was a public cleansing. Hoover made sure of that. He released photos of the crime scene, detailed reports of their supposed arsenal, even stories that Ma had fired on agents for hours. Whether true or not, it didn't matter. The narrative was clear. Justice had prevailed, and the nation could sleep safer. But for those who had known the Barkers, the story wasn't so simple. In Oklahoma, in Missouri, in the dusty small towns they once called home, people remembered a different Ma Barker. They remembered a woman who helped neighbors, who handed out food when others had none, who never stopped talking about her boys as if they were heroes. They couldn't reconcile that woman with the monster the papers described. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Ma Barker. Not that she was evil, but that she was human, flawed, blinded by love, and caught in a world that made villains out of survivors. As the decades passed, her story became a mirror for America's own contradictions. In the 1950s, when Hollywood rediscovered the gangster myth, Ma Barker was reborn on the silver screen. Actresses played her as cold, cunning, and bloodthirsty, a mother who led her sons to their doom with the click of a trigger. In the 1970s, the story took on new tones. Feminist critics saw her as a twisted product of patriarchy, a woman who seized power the only way she could. In later years, she became a pop culture icon, referenced in songs, television, and even video games. Everyone wanted a piece of Ma Barker, but no one wanted the truth. The truth was too messy, too human, too sad. There's an image that lingers, a photograph taken after the shootout. It shows the house riddled with holes, the walls splintered, the furniture destroyed. In the corner of the frame, sunlight cuts through the smoke, illuminating a simple chair. They say it's where Ma sat during the siege, gun in hand, shouting orders to her son. But there's another version of the story. Some say she wasn't holding a gun at all. Some say she was lying in bed, caught in the crossfire, that Fred did all the shooting. The FBI never clarified, and maybe they didn't want to. The image of a mother clutching a gun and dying in battle was too powerful to let go of. Truth became secondary to myth. In the end, Ma Barker became less of a person and more of a story, a cautionary tale told in different voices through different decades. But for all the retellings, one thing remains constant: the strange, haunting pull of her love. Whether you see her as a villain or a victim, there's something undeniably tragic about her devotion. She wanted her family to be strong, to survive in a world that had given them nothing. She gave them that strength, but it came wrapped in violence, and it consumed them all. The last words she ever spoke, according to the FBI's report, were shouted over the roar of gunfire. "Don't shoot my boy!" There's no way to know if that's true. Maybe it's just another piece of fiction stitched into the fabric of her myth. But it feels right. It feels like something she would say. Because even at the end, even as the world collapsed around her, Ma Barker was still just a mother trying to protect her son, and maybe that's why her story endures. Not because of the crimes, not because of the headlines, but because somewhere, buried beneath the smoke and blood, there's a truth that people recognize. Love, in its purest and most dangerous form, can destroy as much as it protects. And that's a story as old as time itself. The winter of 1935 came biting down on the Midwest like a steel trap, and the Barker boys were running out of road. Every newspaper from Chicago to Kansas City carried their faces. The FBI, led by the relentless Melvin Purvis, was tightening the noose. What once had been a tight-knit family operating in the shadows was now a hunted pack, bleeding, paranoid, and fractured. Ma Barker, sitting at the heart of it all, could feel the walls closing in, but she refused to believe her reign was over. In her mind, she was still the queen of her boys, the woman who had outsmarted the law for over a decade. But fate, like the winter wind, had turned cold against her. The Barker-Karpis Gang had been one of the last great outlaw families left after the government's crusade against Depression-era criminals. Dillinger was dead. Bonnie and Clyde were gone. Pretty Boy Floyd was cut down in an Ohio field. Even Babyface Nelson's brutal fire had been extinguished. And now, all eyes turned to the mother and her sons who had turned bank robbery into a family business. The Barker hideout stretched across the Midwest, but it was Florida, Ocala to be exact, that became their final refuge. They'd fled there after the collapse of a kidnapping ransom scheme that brought in big money but even bigger heat. The gang had been living high on the hog, mansions, fast cars, silk shirts, but the FBI had traced the ransom bills, and their luck began to unravel, thread by thread. Ma Barker, despite her growing paranoia, insisted that she and her favorite son, Fred, hole up in a 2-story lakeside house. The air was thick with humidity and tension, the swamp nearby whispering like a warning. She believed they could wait it out, that the law would move on to easier prey. But Purvis wasn't the kind of man to let go of a lead once he caught its scent. Inside the hideout, days melted into one another. Fred kept the radio low, listening for word of raids, arrests, or any sign that the net was closing in. Ma played cards, cleaned her guns, and muttered under her breath about betrayal. Every creak in the floorboards felt like an omen. Every bark of a dog outside made her fingers twitch toward the trigger. She had raised her sons to be fearless, to take what the world denied them, but now she found herself consumed by fear of losing it all. Fred was her favorite, the one most like her, hot-headed, loyal, and dangerous. He'd robbed banks, shot men, and laughed in the face of death, but around his mother he softened. She was his center, his guide. Without her, he said, he'd have been nothing but another dead crook. Yet beneath that loyalty was exhaustion. He was tired of running, tired of hiding. The FBI had made sure every safe house, every friendly face was compromised. There were whispers that even Alvin Karpis, the gang's brains, was looking for a way out, a way to save his own skin. One January morning, as the fog rolled thick over Lake Weir, Fred woke to the sound of distant engines. He froze, listening. It wasn't the casual rumble of locals. It was deliberate, coordinated. He rushed to the window and saw black sedans approaching from the main road, slow and steady. "Ma," he said quietly, "they found us." She didn't flinch. Instead, she rose from her chair, smoothing her hair as if preparing for church. "Well," she said in a calm, almost eerie voice, "we ain't going without a fight." By the time the cars stopped and men began surrounding the house, Ma and Fred were armed and ready. Purvis and his agents took positions in the trees and behind cars, their rifles glinting under the morning light. A loudspeaker barked out an order. "This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Come out with your hands up." Silence. Then a single gunshot cracked through the still air. That one shot unleashed hell. Bullets tore through the walls, splintering wood, shattering glass. Fred returned fire from an upstairs window, the recoil echoing through the small house. Ma crouched behind a sofa, firing blindly toward the lakefront. For 4 hours the battle raged. The FBI fired thousands of rounds into the house, unwilling to rush in and risk another massacre like Little Bohemia. Smoke filled the air, gunpowder burning the back of the throat. Inside, the mother and son shouted to each other between bursts of gunfire. "Hold on, Ma," Fred yelled. "Don't you worry, boy," she shouted back, her voice ragged but fierce. "They'll never take us alive." It was a line she had probably said 100 times before, but this time it carried the weight of prophecy. As the hours dragged on, the agents outside grew uneasy. No return fire came. The house had gone silent except for the occasional crack of burning wood. Finally, Purvis ordered a ceasefire. The silence that followed was deafening. When the agents finally entered the house, smoke still hung in the air like a ghost. The walls were riddled with bullet holes, furniture shredded, blood splattered on the floorboards. They found Fred's body first, slumped near a window, a Thompson submachine gun still clutched in his hand. Ma was nearby, lying face down with a pistol by her side. 2 bullets had found her, one in the chest, one near the heart. Purvis stood there, hat in hand, staring down at the woman who had been painted by newspapers as the most dangerous mother in America. Some of his men whispered that she had fired on them. Others doubted it. The truth was lost in the smoke. What mattered was the symbol she had become, a mother who raised her sons not to obey the law but to defy it. News of Ma Barker's death spread like wildfire. The press turned her into a legend overnight. Headlines screamed Ma Barker slain, and public enemy mother dies in gun battle. Photographs of her lifeless body appeared in papers across the country. To the public, she became a dark icon, part villain, part folk hero. The FBI called her the ruthless matriarch of a crime family, the brains behind every robbery and kidnapping. But those who knew her, even her enemies, wondered if that was true. Alvin Karpis, the last of the Barker-Karpis Gang, would later claim that Ma had never planned a single heist, never even understood the mechanics of their schemes. She couldn't organize breakfast, he once said bitterly. The FBI made her out to be something she wasn't. She just liked being with her boys. But perception is a powerful thing. In the 1930s, America needed its villains, the gangsters who had grown rich while ordinary families starved. Ma Barker was perfect for the role, a mother-turned-monster, a symbol of moral decay. It didn't matter whether she actually led the gang or simply followed her sons into darkness. The legend had already taken hold. In the years that followed, the Barker story became a cautionary tale, twisted and retold through books, radio shows, and Hollywood movies. Some portrayed her as a criminal mastermind. Others painted her as a tragic mother whose love blinded her to her son's sins. The truth likely lay somewhere in between. What couldn't be denied was that she had lived and died by a code that was as brutal as it was simple. Family above all else. She'd loved her boys fiercely, and that love had destroyed them. The Florida house where she died became a macabre attraction, visited by curious locals and crime buffs. The bullet holes were never filled in, the walls still bearing the scars of that fateful day. People swore they could feel something there, a chill in the air, a whisper of voices, the faint echo of gunfire across the lake. Even death couldn't erase the myth. The Barker name faded into history, but its shadow lingered. Every generation rediscovers them, the mother and her sons who took on the world and lost. For some, Ma Barker remains the embodiment of evil, the twisted heart of a criminal empire. For others, she's a tragic relic of a time when desperation turned ordinary people into outlaws. Either way, her story endures. Maybe because it speaks to something deep in the human soul, the hunger for power, the blindness of love, and the high price of defiance. Somewhere out there, On the quiet shores of Lake Weir, the ghosts of Ma and Fred Barker still linger. And if you listen close enough, you might just hear her whisper, defiant to the end, "They'll never take us alive."